It all started with a casual conversation over the fence. My neighbor, Lisa, was watering her plants when she waved me over. "Hey, Ryan," she called. "I've been meaning to tell you something." I stepped closer, wiping my hands on my jeans. It was a crisp, quiet afternoon, and I'd been tidying up my yard. Lisa glanced around nervously before leaning in, lowering her voice. "Have you been hearing anything at night?" she asked. "Not really," I replied. "Why?" She hesitated, then said, "I've been hearing noises from your place. It's faint, but it sounds like it's coming from your basement, usually late at night." That caught me off guard. My basement was a cluttered mess of old furniture, tools, and boxes I hadn't unpacked since moving in 6 months ago. I rarely went down there, especially at night. "Maybe it's the pipes or something," I suggested. Lisa shook her head. "I don't think so. It sounds like..." She paused, her brow furrowing. "Like whispers." I laughed nervously. "Whispers? Come on, Lisa." "I'm serious," she said, crossing her arms. "You should check it out, just in case." I thanked her, brushed it off as paranoia, and went back to my chores. But that night, her words lingered in my mind. Whispers? From my basement? It sounded ridiculous. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Around 11 p.m., I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors. I was about to doze off when I heard it, a faint sound, like someone muttering under their breath. I froze, straining to listen. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a neighbor's TV. But as I lay there, the sound grew clearer. It was coming from below. My heart began to race. Lisa's warning echoed in my mind. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my imagination. But curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing my phone for light, I slipped out of bed and crept downstairs. The kitchen was dark and still, the only sound my bare feet against the cold tile floor. I opened the basement door, and a rush of cool, damp air greeted me. The whispers had stopped. I hesitated, my hand on the light switch. The bulb above the stairs flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. I shook my head, feeling foolish. This is ridiculous, I thought. Taking a deep breath, I started down the stairs, the wood creaking beneath my weight. The flashlight beam from my phone danced across the walls, illuminating stacks of boxes and an old workbench. Everything looked as it should. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd. A faint scuff mark on the dusty concrete floor, leading toward a pile of storage bins in the corner. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. The air felt heavier here, tinged with a faint metallic smell. I nudged one of the bins aside with my foot and saw something that made my stomach drop. A small, jagged hole in the wall, just big enough for someone to squeeze through. My mind raced. Was someone down here? A squatter? A thief? I backed away, my phone trembling in my hand. That's when I heard it again. The whispers. This time, they were louder and more distinct and unmistakably human. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the room. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, from the shadows, something moved. A figure darted toward the stairs, too fast for me to make out any details. Instinct kicked in, and I bolted after them, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The figure reached the stairs first, their silhouette briefly illuminated by the dim light. Just as I lunged forward, the basement door slammed shut with a resounding thud, plunging me into darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stood frozen, my mind racing. Who was that? How did they get in? And more importantly, were they still in my house? For a few moments, I stood there, paralyzed in the pitch-black basement, listening to the frantic thudding of my own heartbeat. My phone's flashlight wavered as my hand trembled. Whoever had bolted for the stairs was gone now, or so I hoped. I needed answers. Forcing myself to move, I climbed the stairs two at a time and pushed against the door. It didn't budge. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, slamming my shoulder into it. Someone had locked me in. Panic bubbled up, but I swallowed it down. "Think, Ryan. Think." I flipped through my phone for a signal. No bars. Of course, the basement walls were too thick. My only option was to go back down and figure out what was going on. The basement felt even colder now, the air heavy with a sense of dread. I made my way toward the small hole in the wall I'd found earlier. Kneeling down, I shone my light into the darkness beyond. The jagged edges of the hole led into a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person. My stomach churned at the thought of crawling in, but I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I squeezed through, my shoulders brushing against the rough concrete. The flashlight's beam barely illuminated the path ahead. The passage smelled damp and earthy, like it hadn't been touched in years. I moved slowly, the whispers replaying in my mind, haunting me. The tunnel opened into a larger space, some sort of hidden room. My flashlight revealed a crude setup, a worn mattress, empty food cans, and scattered clothes. Someone had been living down here. My skin crawled. This wasn't just a random intruder. This was deliberate. Then I noticed something else. On the far wall, pinned up like some twisted gallery, were photographs. Dozens of them. My stomach turned as I stepped closer. They were all of me. Pictures of me in my yard, at my kitchen table, even asleep in my bed. My blood ran cold. Someone had been watching me for months. The sound of something scraping behind me made me whirl around, my light darting across the room. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. Silence. Then a soft laugh, low and mocking, echoed through the tunnel. I backed away, my hands shaking. The laugh grew louder, closer. "Stay back," I shouted, gripping a rusted pipe I'd found on the ground. My flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before the light steadied again. That's when I saw them. A man, gaunt, disheveled, and wild-eyed, emerged from the shadows. He wore tattered clothes, and his face was pale and hollow. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most, unblinking, wide with a manic intensity. "You shouldn't have come down here," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could react, he lunged at me. I swung the pipe instinctively, the metal connecting with a sickening thud. The man staggered back, clutching his shoulder, but he didn't go down. Instead, he laughed again, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Adrenaline surged through me. I didn't wait for him to recover. I turned and bolted back through the tunnel, my heart pounding in my chest. The narrow walls scraped against my arms as I squeezed through, desperate to reach the basement. Behind me, the man's footsteps echoed, growing louder. He was gaining on me. I burst into the basement, slamming a storage shelf against the hole to block his path. It wouldn't hold him for long, but it gave me a few precious seconds. I grabbed a crowbar from my workbench and attacked the basement door with everything I had. Wood splintered under the force of my blows, and finally, the lock gave way. I stumbled into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't stop running. I sprinted out of the house and into the street, pounding on Lisa's door until she answered, her eyes wide with shock. "Call the police," I gasped. "There's someone in my house." Within minutes, the street was swarming with flashing red and blue lights. Officers searched the basement and the hidden room, but the man was gone. All they found were the photographs and the remnants of his makeshift camp. That night, I didn't go back inside. I stayed with Lisa, my mind racing with unanswered questions. Who was he? How long had he been watching me? And why did he choose my house? Even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind sends my heart racing. Because once someone like that finds you, you're never really safe again. It started as one of those dull Saturdays. My wife was out shopping, and I figured I might as well tackle the basement storage. It's the kind of chore you put off until you can't find your winter boots or a spare light bulb. Our basement wasn't your run-of-the-mill, damp, spider-infested dungeon. It was more like a shared storage area, with rows of lockers for each apartment and a small service elevator for moving heavy items. Still, it had its fair share of cobwebs and that ever-present smell of concrete and mildew. The service elevator was ancient, probably installed when the building was first constructed decades ago. It was narrow, with scuffed metal walls and a wire gate that screeched whenever it opened or closed. I'd rarely used it, but it was handy for moving stuff like old furniture or boxes of books. That day, I'd decided to clear out some junk that had been sitting there for years. Broken picture frames, a vacuum cleaner that no longer worked, and an old metal cart that had been left by the previous tenants. The cart had a busted wheel and was practically useless, but I figured someone might want to scrap it. The basement was quiet, eerily so. Normally, you'd hear muffled footsteps from above or the hum of water pipes, but not that day. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, even though it was dry as a bone outside. I unlocked my storage locker and started sorting through the mess, tossing things into two piles, keep and trash. About 20 minutes in, I heard the faint hum of the service elevator coming to life. At first, I thought someone else had come down to use it, but when I peeked out from behind the rows of lockers, the elevator was empty. It had stopped at the basement floor, its gate creaking open slowly. I walked over, more annoyed than anything. Maybe someone upstairs had pressed the wrong button. But as I got closer, I noticed the cart inside, the same one I'd left in my storage unit earlier. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I hadn't put it there. I stood frozen for a moment, my brain scrambling to make sense of it. Did someone take it and then send the elevator back down? But why? And who? There was no one else around. I leaned into the elevator, looking up and down the narrow shaft. Nothing but darkness and faint whirring sounds. The cart sat in the center of the elevator, as if inviting me to take it. The metal gate groaned as I stepped closer, my curiosity outweighing my unease. As soon as I reached for the cart, I felt it. A sudden vice-like grip around my wrist. My instincts kicked in, and I yanked my arm back with all the strength I could muster. The force sent me stumbling backward, crashing into the row of lockers behind me. My wrist burned, and when I looked down, I could see red marks, finger-shaped bruises, forming almost instantly. I didn't wait to figure out what had grabbed me. Adrenaline took over, and I bolted for the stairs, my shoes slapping against the concrete floor. I could hear the elevator gate screeching behind me, but I didn't dare look back. My legs felt like lead as I climbed the steps two at a time, my chest heaving with every breath. By the time I reached the main floor, my hands were trembling so badly, I could barely open the door to my apartment. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, leaning against the wall to catch my breath. My mind raced with questions. Who or what had grabbed me? How did the cart get into the elevator? I stared at my wrist, the bruises darkening by the second, and a cold chill ran down my spine. Whatever had happened down there, I wasn't going back anytime soon. But the nightmare wasn't over. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the hours until my wife would come home. I thought about calling her, but what would I even say? Something grabbed me in the basement? It sounded ridiculous. So I kept quiet, pacing the apartment and trying to convince myself it had to be some sort of prank. Maybe one of the neighbors messing around. Yet the bruises on my wrist told a different story. They ached, sharp and persistent, as if to remind me that what I'd felt was very real. That night, I woke up to a noise. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a faint metallic screeching, but as I came to, the sound grew louder and more distinct. It was the service elevator. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The elevator wasn't supposed to operate at night. The building manager had mentioned it shut down automatically after 10 p.m. I checked the clock. 2:13 a.m. I tried to shake it off. Maybe someone was moving something late, though that explanation felt flimsy. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on our apartment door. I froze. The sound echoed through the silent apartment, each knock more insistent than the last. My wife stirred beside me, mumbling groggily. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her eyes wide with confusion. I got out of bed and crept toward the door. My hands trembled as I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, just the flickering light above the elevator at the far end, casting long, shifting shadows. Another knock, louder this time, but it wasn't at the door. It was coming from the floor below. "Stay here," I told my wife, grabbing the baseball bat I kept by the closet. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. I made my way to the stairwell, the bat gripped tightly in my hands. As I descended, the air grew colder, heavier, like the basement itself was alive. The elevator was at the basement level, its gate ajar. The cart was gone. In its place, a set of muddy footprints led from the elevator to the far corner of the room, disappearing behind a row of lockers. My breathing quickened as I followed them, every step echoing in the oppressive silence. When I rounded the corner, I saw it. The cart overturned, its wheels spinning slowly, and next to it, a man I didn't recognize, sprawled on the floor clutching his leg. His face was pale, his lips trembling. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely audible. It won't let me go." Before I could respond, the lights flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, the sound of my own breathing deafening in my ears. And then something moved. Not the man, something else behind me. I swung the bat blindly, but it hit nothing but air. A guttural sound, almost like a growl, came from the shadows. I felt a hand brush against my shoulder, cold and clammy. That was all it took. I ran, tripping over boxes and crashing into lockers as I scrambled for the stairs. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I slammed the door shut and called the police. They arrived within minutes, combing through the basement with flashlights and walkie-talkies. But they found nothing. No footprints, no overturned cart, and certainly no man. Just the elevator sitting at the basement floor, its gate slightly ajar, as if mocking me. One officer examined my wrist, his expression shifting from skeptical to concerned when he saw the bruises. "Looks like you had a nasty encounter," he muttered, but his tone suggested he didn't believe my story. They left soon after, leaving me with a half-hearted assurance to call if anything else happens. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every groan of the pipes, felt amplified in the oppressive silence of my apartment. My wife tried to reassure me, chalking it up to a bad dream or a prank gone too far. But I knew better. The bruises on my wrist didn't fade for weeks, a constant reminder of that cold, crushing grip. A few days later, I overheard my neighbor in the hallway. He was telling someone about an old rumor tied to the building, a story about a maintenance worker who had gone missing years ago, last seen repairing the service elevator. His tools were found in the basement, but he wasn't. I wanted to dismiss it as urban legend, but it explained the man I saw clutching his leg, begging for help. I've since locked the door to the basement and avoided going down there altogether. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it. The faint hum of the elevator coming to life, like it's waiting for me. And every time I pray, I never hear that gate screech open again. It was late afternoon when I finished cleaning the garage and decided to finally tackle the basement. We had just moved into this house a few months ago, and the basement had been one of those places I kept putting off. It wasn't too big, just an unfinished space with concrete floors and old shelves that were piled high, with random boxes and tools. The kind of place you shove all the junk that doesn't fit anywhere else. I wasn't exactly looking forward to going down there, but I had to do it. We were having some friends over in a couple of days, and I needed to clear out a spot to store the extra chairs and stuff. I grabbed the flashlight, locked the basement door behind me, and headed upstairs to grab a few things from the living room. The door to the basement had an old lock, one of those simple bolt locks that doesn't seem like it'd hold up in any real emergency. But it did the job. I was extra cautious when I left that day. I didn't want anyone wandering down there, especially with the tools and the random boxes scattered around. After I finished upstairs, I checked the door again before I headed out to grab dinner. It wasn't until later that evening when the weirdness started. I came home after a quick trip to the store, walked up the stairs, and went straight to the kitchen. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange about the basement door. At first, I thought I was just tired, maybe imagining things, but then I stopped. The lock. It was broken. I had locked it before leaving. I remember locking it. The bolt was no longer in place, and the door was slightly ajar, maybe just an inch or two. It wasn't like that when I left. I tried to ignore the pit forming in my stomach, telling myself I must have forgotten to lock it or that something shifted while I was gone. But when I opened the door and stepped inside, the air felt heavier, colder, like someone had just been there. The flashlight beam caught on something that shouldn't have been there. Tools. My tools, scattered all over the floor. I didn't touch anything, but it was obvious. The place had been rummaged through. But here's the thing. Nothing was missing. The tools were there, just in disarray. I stared at the mess, trying to make sense of it. Why would someone break into my basement, scatter a few tools around, and leave everything behind? It made no sense. No one else had a key. I was sure of it. The house was empty when I left. I checked the windows, but they were still sealed. No signs of forced entry. No signs that anyone had been inside, other than the tools being tossed around like someone was looking for something. I thought about calling the cops, but decided against it. What would I even say? Hey, someone broke into my basement and didn't steal anything. They just left everything a mess. It felt too weird, too insignificant. So I just locked the door again and went about my evening, trying to push it out of my mind. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house felt quieter than usual. It's hard to explain, but I felt like I was being watched, like someone was lurking just out of sight, waiting. I tried to shake it off, thinking I was just overreacting. After all, we'd only been in the house for a couple of months, and I was still getting used to the creaks and groans of old floors. I was sitting on the couch trying to distract myself with TV when I heard it. Voices. Soft, muffled voices like whispers. They seemed to be coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the TV. But no, this was different. I muted the sound and strained to listen. The voices weren't from the TV. They were coming from the basement. I checked the time. 10:45 p.m. No one else was home. I felt a cold rush of panic flood over me. I grabbed the flashlight again, my heart pounding, and crept toward the basement door. The voices continued, muffled but distinct. My breath was shallow as I stood there, frozen, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Who could it be? Had someone somehow gotten back in? Had I missed something earlier? I told myself to calm down, to think rationally, but the voices kept going, and the longer I stood there, the more I realized something was horribly, horribly wrong. I stood there in the dark, my mind racing. The voices were faint but unmistakable. There was no one else in the house. No one. And yet, There they were, coming from the basement. My hands were trembling, and the flashlight shook in my grip as I slowly turned the knob of the basement door. I half expected it to creak loudly, but it didn't. It opened with an eerie quietness that made my stomach drop. The whispers stopped immediately. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of my own heartbeat. I turned the flashlight on and stepped inside, the beam cutting through the dark. The basement looked exactly the same as I had left it. Tools still scattered across the floor, but no sign of anyone. The air felt unnaturally cold, though, like a chill had settled into the room. I took a few cautious steps forward, my shoes clicking against the concrete floor. Every shadow seemed to stretch further than it should have, and the quiet was suffocating. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like I was walking into a space that didn't belong to me anymore. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something. It was subtle, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. A small piece of metal, shiny and sharp, was lodged in the concrete, just near the corner of the room. I hadn't seen it before, and I had no idea where it had come from. I crouched down, my breath shallow, and reached out to touch it. Before I could get any closer, I heard it again, a sound that made my stomach lurch. A loud bang came from the back of the room. It wasn't a person. It was something heavy falling, something metal. I jumped back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My pulse was hammering in my ears now, and I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted toward the door, stumbling over tools, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The basement door slammed shut behind me as I reached the stairs, and I didn't even stop to lock it again. But that's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy footsteps, like someone was following me, their boots echoing behind me as I sprinted up the stairs. My breath caught in my throat and I nearly tripped, my hands slapping against the wall to steady myself. I couldn't look back. I couldn't even process what was happening. I just needed to get out of there. I reached the top of the stairs, heart in my throat, and turned to slam the door shut. But it wouldn't lock. The lock was jammed. I struggled with it, panic rising in my chest, my mind racing, telling me that whoever or whatever was down there was coming for me. Finally, the door clicked, and I locked it, gasping for breath. I leaned against it, trying to steady myself, and for a long moment, I just listened. Silence. The house was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. No footsteps, no voices, just the normal hum of the refrigerator and the distant creak of the floorboards. But I knew something was wrong. I had no idea who had been in my basement or why they were there, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was no way I could stay in this house another night, not after what I'd heard, what I'd felt. I stood there for a while, my mind spinning, until a strange thought occurred to me. What if the person in my basement wasn't the one who broke in earlier? What if they were still here, waiting, watching? And if they were, what else were they capable of? I didn't know, but I didn't plan to stick around and find out.